I'm going to be honest, I am a huge fan of Star Wars. Not a huge fan as in a, you can't disagree with my opinion, Revenge of the Sith is the best, and no, you cannot say The Empire Strikes Back is better way, but in a, I just really like the universe and world building way. This is simply because I just really love the genre of science fiction. I've done videos on stuff like Warhammer, Halo, Mass Effect, and Destiny 2. However, I haven't done a video on Star Wars, and that is because of one primary reason that you have probably guessed based on the title alone. There's a disturbing lack of recent Star Wars games. Now, of course, a lot of Star Wars games have come out in the past, just look at them. They were coming out left and right. Look to the left, boom, Star Wars for the Atari. Look to the right, Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. Look straight ahead, Star Wars for the Famicom or the NES. These are just 3 of them, by the way. Hell, if we go a little bit further into the future, into the 2000s, we have the holy grail of Star Wars games that are widely praised today. Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2, the original Battlefront and Battlefront 2, Republic Commando, and finally Bounty Hunter. Now let us look at the Star Wars games that have been released in the last 5 years. Alright, 4. Remove the games that have immediately died or that most of the fanbase didn't care about. Alright, 3. All of them are pretty good. Oh wait, even 3080s can't run one of them. So what happened? Well, before I start explaining the history of Star Wars games, I would just like to say something. This video wasn't made to hate on newer Star Wars games, and quality over quantity is almost always a good thing. I just want to explain what has happened and provide some ideas as to what games they could make at the end. The history of Star Wars games are pretty complex. The first Star Wars game ever made was Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back by the American toy company Parker Brothers for the Atari 2600. I've heard that it was actually a pretty good game for its time, and compared to other Atari games, yeah, it looks pretty good. After the first Star Wars game came out, other games started coming out one by one. The arcade game came out, which was made by the same company, and after that, Atari Incorporated made the Return of the Jedi game. These are all pretty good, but if we just take one step ahead, we are met with the once Goliath of the gaming industry, Lucasfilm Games, or LucasArts. When LucasArts made their first Star Wars game, which was Super Star Wars for the SNES, they had already made several classics like The Secret of Monkey Island. Super Star Wars for the SNES was a 2D run-and-gun game, which was of course the classic formula for any game in the NES or SNES era. And it was certainly a good game, considering it was the first time LucasArts had dipped their toe into Star Wars games. After realizing that they could actually make Star Wars games, they slowly made the 2 sequels to Super Star Wars, the Empire Strikes Back version and the Return of the Jedi version. All of these games had above average ratings, but the one that was rated the highest was of course the first Super Star Wars. Just 1 year after Super Star Wars Return of the Jedi, a new Star Wars game series would come out. This game series, however, was far from just another ordinary Star Wars game. This series, and specifically the second game, would become one of the forefathers of modern FPS games. This series is the Star Wars Dark Forces series made by LucasArts. Dark Forces was one of the first Star Wars games that had its own story. The first game's story follows a mercenary named Kyle Katam working for the Rebellion, where he discovers the Empire's Dark Trooper project, and holy shit, this is just Metal Gear Star Wars. But the story isn't what made the game a forefather of modern FPS. What was really important was in the second game, and it was the ability to look up and down. Yes, this game was one of the first games ever that provided players the ability to look up and down. I bought both of the Dark Forces games just for this video, and here's my opinion. The first Dark Forces is pretty good. It's a good Doom-like game set in a Star Wars universe. And the second game is even better in my opinion. The looking around part is extremely smooth and it works even better on new platforms like Windows 10. However, its default aiming system is inverted. Who the hell makes something like that? I mean, I know it was a different time, but why inverted? Speaking of different times, there's only one game left I'm going to cover before we enter the golden age of Star Wars games. And that game is Star Wars The Phantom Menace Pinball! No, just kidding. It is the 1998 game Rogue Squadron made by LucasArts and a company called Factor 5. Not to be confused with the film Rogue One, by the way. Rogue Squadron was yet another game that did something important. It's almost as if that's becoming a theme. This flight action game was one of the first games to use the N64's RAM add-on. The game was highly praised, getting a Metacritic score above games like Fallout New Vegas. Even though it got a high score, I don't feel it would be appropriate for me to comment on this game more, since I don't really play flight action games, so I might get some gameplay details wrong, but based purely on the fact that it got a high score and it was on the N64, it was probably like Star Fox, but you could move around, and I like Star Fox. Now that I've covered the 90s, we are entering the golden age of Star Wars games, which is a period starting from 2000 to 2013. There's a really good chance that at least one of your favorite Star Wars games are from this time. In this time period, we'll also see multiple incredibly popular and talented game developers such as Obsidian Entertainment and yes, still LucasArts. Speaking of LucasArts, alongside a few other companies, they developed and published Star Wars Starfighter, yet another flight action game, but this time it resembles games like modern Battlefront a lot more. After Starfighter, the next important game was the third-person shooter, Star Wars Bounty Hunter. Released in 2002, Bounty Hunter followed Jango Fett and told the players more about him, since people didn't really know much about him at that time, besides that he was a bounty hunter and that he was cloned for the clone army. But these two games would probably not be the first thing you'd think about if you thought about the golden age of Star Wars. It would be the game made by the people who would go on to make Mass Effect, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, released in 2003. This game introduced the Old Republic era of Star Wars to the video game world, and this game also contained the most in-depth story of any Star Wars game up to this point. The story follows just a guy who becomes a Jedi Knight who is eventually set on a journey to stop Darth Malak, who is waging war on a universal scale against the Jedi and the Old Republic. I could make a whole video about this game, however I have to keep it brief because I still have many games left to cover, so I'll just say this. I like Mass Effect, I like Dungeons and Dragons, and I like Star Wars. This game is a combination of all three. Then, a year later, in 2004, the second KOTOR came out, but this time it was made by Obsidian. Good choice by LucasArts, since we now know that these studios are more than capable of producing amazing stories. This game takes place 5 years later after the first one, when the Jedi Order has been destroyed by the Sith. The story follows a Jedi exile on a journey to reunite the Jedi Order and to fight against the Sith. There were a lot of important Star Wars games that were released at the same time in the early 2000s, and one of those games was released in the same year as KOTOR 2. That game is the first Battlefront, made by the now defunct developer, Pandemic. A moment of silence for Pandemic. The first Battlefront was and still is an amazing game since it actually holds up to this very day. I don't know if my eyes have just gotten used to these graphics, but I think it looks pretty good for a 2004 game, and it plays just as it looks. Maybe a little bit aged, but overall perfect. Battlefront 1 also had a good single player campaign. Of course, the game does have a few problems like 2004 AI, but that isn't a big problem, and the pros outweigh the cons by a mile. Then after that came out Battlefront 2 in 2005. Battlefront 2 is everything a sequel should aim to be. New vehicles, game modes, characters, mechanics, maps, and a whole new campaign. This campaign is better in every way. It's more narrative driven than Battlefront 1. It tells the story of a stormtrooper from his time as a clone to his servitude in the Empire. Then, in the same year as Battlefront 2, Republic Commando came out, a FPS game that features a squad of elite clone commandos, with you having to work alongside your AI-controlled clone squad in order to finish the mission. 2005 was, of course, a very intense year for Star Wars games, but it is still not finished, since starting from 2005, we would start to see the LEGO Star Wars games. LEGO Star Wars the video game released in 2005, then 1 year later the second part, LEGO Star Wars 2 the original trilogy, was released. Finally in 2007, TT Games combined both of them to make LEGO Star Wars the complete saga. I don't even think I need to explain much about this game because this game was your childhood if you were born in the 2000s, featuring classics as the Gonk Droid and the Yoda Death Scream. It was truly the pinnacle of gaming and I must have played through it around 10 times. Just 1 year after the complete saga in 2008, one of my favorite Star Wars games of all time came out. The Force Unleashed, made fully by LucasArts. I loved and still do love this game. It provides world building, a good story, and Devil May Star Wars. Yes, Force Unleashed 1 and 2 were the first and only hack and slash Star Wars games to ever come out. I have a lot of personal experience with this game compared to things like KOTOR that came out before I was born. This game was my first Star Wars game that wasn't a LEGO game, and I can still remember experiencing the combat for the first time. It feels good, maybe not as good as other hack and slash classics like Devil May Cry, but it is not at all bad. The story follows the man capable of pulling down an entire Star Destroyer using the Force, Galen Marek, aka Starkiller, in a story both as an apprentice of Vader and a Jedi. After that story, there was a sequel that follows a clone of Starkiller, but I won't say any more because I don't want to give any spoilers. We are getting scarily close to the end of the Golden Age. There are two last games worth talking about before 2013, if I'm not forgetting anything. The first is the Old Republic, the Star Wars MMO game with those awesome trailers. Seriously, if you haven't even heard of the game, there is a pretty good chance you have seen these trailers. Shockingly, the game is still getting updated frequently. It gets more content per year than Minecraft, which is something to think about. If you have the time and you like MMOs, I would highly suggest you check it out. In the same year as the Old Republic, TT Games made Star Wars 3, The Clone Wars, which was a game about the Clone Wars. It was one of my favorite games back then because it had that sick open world. That's still, in my opinion, the best open world LEGO has ever made. Here we are, the beginning of 2013, the end of the Golden Age, and where I answered the question, what happened? Well, what happened is that Disney had bought Star Wars back in October of 2012, and now they had decided to shut down LucasArts, the legendary company responsible for either publishing or making many people's favorite games. After shutting down LucasArts, they rented out the license of making Star Wars games to everyone's favorite company, E-fucking-A, who was now the sole licensor. Since 2013, we have only gotten a handful of Star Wars games. We had the Battlefront reboots, which were good, mostly the second game, but the second game was clouded by a mist of microtransactions. But thankfully, EA learned their lesson and surprisingly removed them, but the damage had already been done. Then we had that one LEGO game that was pretty mediocre because it was based on one mediocre movie instead of a whole trilogy. But it was finally a single player game since the last one had been LEGO Star Wars 3, 4 years ago. In my personal experience though, the game hardly met my expectations since it was a real downgrade from the old LEGO games. The next game that came out was in 2019 and it was the phenomenal Jedi Fallen Order. This was the first game made since 2013 that seriously amazed me. It was a Souls-like Star Wars game which wasn't something I knew I wanted, but something I definitely needed. I'm not talking much about these new games because you'll likely know them. Right after Jedi Fallen Order, we had Squadrons. Yeah, we sure had Squadrons. Jedi Fallen Order was pretty good and I was excited to play it, but it was nothing compared to the excitement I felt for the Skywalker Saga. When this game was announced, I was doing the soy Wojak face in my seat, because as a person who had grown up with LEGO games, an ultimate LEGO game was amazing news. And then it came out. It was, unfortunately, no, I'm kidding. It was pretty good. However, it had a few big problems like the trailing missions, that annoying mechanic where you start a mission only to not start a mission and then you just have to walk to where you actually start a mission like GTA 5, and finally, trailing missions. We have finally gotten to the last and most recent game, Jedi Survivor. I've heard it's pretty good as a game, however it turned out to be the new can it run crisis statement, like can it run Jedi Survivor though? Since I've heard that even 3080s can't run it properly with people saying things like, I'm not your beta tester, EA. So, yikes. Like I've said in the beginning, quality over quantity is almost always a good thing. However, what is not a good thing is reducing the quantity of the games alongside the quality. Every game ever made since 2013 except Jedi Fallen Order and most of the Skywalker Saga had a drop in quality alongside the decreasing number of Star Wars games. Which is very unfortunate because I don't understand how they cannot come up with a good idea and a story for a Star Wars game. Here are just some of the ideas I have. You can disagree with me in the comments if you want, I listen to criticism. A Star Wars game that humanizes the Empire. Not in a way that it retells the story as if they were the good guys, but more so a game that follows the life of a stormtrooper, who joined the Empire either for fun or because the rebels did something bad to him. The game might end with the stormtrooper realizing that his actions were wrong or something like that. Maybe they get killed, maybe they decide to become an agent for the rebels. Who knows? Or maybe they could make another Old Republic game, adding more content to the Old Republic era. I know it isn't canon now, but just say it isn't canon and make an Old Republic game. A Darth Vader game might actually be pretty cool. Maybe taking inspirations from the comics made by Marvel, but it would actually be pretty hard to make the players feel like Darth Vader. A game set during the Clone Wars that is about a mutated group of clones just like the Clone Commandos or the Bad Batch. I know Republic Commando has done this, but I would like to see a new version of this game instead of them just remastering Republic Commando. You could also make this game a Quake or a Doom-like game. Imagine a mutated clone facing down hordes of Geonosians. In general, I think that Star Wars games could use darker tones. Not gory, but just a game that makes the enemies feel like actual threats instead of just cones on the road. Those are my ideas for Star Wars games, but if you have more, please comment about them since I would really like to hear them. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, I would really appreciate if you could subscribe. Goodbye. Oh shit, I forgot about Jedi Academy.